Hello, my name's John Mullan. I'm Professor of English at University College London. I'm Professor of English at University College London, and fairly recently I've been the editor of the Oxford World's Classics edition of Sense and Sensibility, which is the novel I'm going to talk about. The first topic I'd like to talk about is money in the novel. Money is particularly important in Sense and Sensibility, and we know that it matters very much in the novel because Marianne, one of the two sisters who are the lead characters in Sense and Sensibility, and a character who's very often mistaken in her strong opinions, tells her sister that actually money matters hardly at all. And that's a sure guide to the fact that it does matter. And quite early on in the novel, they have a discussion, a kind of argument really, which is playful on Eleanor's part, but deadly serious on Marianne's part. And one of the things about Marianne is that she is usually deadly serious. And she asks Eleanor a question: what have wealth or grandeur to do with happiness? Grandeur has but little, said Eleanor, but wealth has much to do with it. Eleanor, for shame, said Marianne. Money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. Beyond a competence, it can afford no real satisfaction as far as mere self is concerned. Marianne here is all indignation, and she's very prone to exclamations. So here she exclaims, for shame! A competence, beyond a competence, she says, it can afford no real satisfaction. A competence is the early 19th century word for what we might say is enough to live on. But how much is a competence? And that's actually a question that gets asked. Eleanor says to Marianne, come, what is your competence? About 1,800 or 2,000 a year. Not more than that. Eleanor laughed. 2,000 a year? One is my wealth. I guessed how it would end. Now, we no longer know what £2,000 a year in 1811, when the novel was published, would be worth. But I think we already know enough about these two characters to infer that it's a lot of money. Austen's first readers, of course, would have known exactly how much £2,000 a year was, and therefore just how absurd Marianne is being. And she's making herself more absurd by defending this necessary sum. I'm sure I'm not extravagant in my demands. A proper establishment of servants, a carriage, perhaps two, and hunters cannot be supported on less. Hunters meaning horses that you use for fox hunting. And of course, by this stage, she's got to know Willoughby a bit, and he's very keen on riding and hunting, and so she's influenced by this. A carriage, by the way, requires a lot of money. If you're going to keep a carriage in a Jane Austen novel, you've got to have carriage horses, stabling, you've got to be able to feed those horses, you've got to have special servants to look after the horses, to drive the carriage. So possession of a carriage is a really crucial sign of wealth in Austen novels. And you might remember that earlier in Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor actually has to persuade her mother, who's nearly as foolish as Marianne about money, that they're not going to be able to keep a carriage in Devon. They simply don't have enough. So Marianne's idea of what a competence is to the contemporary reader, but I think also to the shrewd modern reader, absurdly extravagant. She is in a way a hypocrite about money, because she says it doesn't really matter, but in fact she has very high ideas about how much money she expects or she needs. And Austen's very good at inviting us to hear characters' hypocrisy about money. Think about Lucy Steele, who tells Eleanor, and she's talking here about her secret engagement to Edward, the man that Eleanor loves, and the difficulties that stand in the way of Lucy and Edward getting married. And those difficulties are to do with the lack of money. And Lucy says this: "I have been always used to a very small income and could struggle with any poverty for him. But I love him too well to be the selfish means of robbing him, perhaps of all that his mother might give him if he married to please her." And of course, it's completely disingenuous. Characters in Austen novels who claim that they don't care about money invariably care very much about it. And of course, Lucy is angling to get back in the good offices of Edward's rich mother so that she can benefit from her largesse. Money shapes the story in Sense and Sensibility, giving men and women different degrees of power or powerlessness. And when we think about men and women and money in Sense and Sensibility, we might notice how complicated and subtle it is about whether money follows gendered lines. It doesn't always. Edward Ferrars is a man, but he's financially utterly dependent on a woman, his mother, who has all the money. She's a widow and has considerable power because of her wealth. Mrs. Jennings, on the other hand, is a woman, but has money to burn, apparently. Again, she's a widow and is independently wealthy. There are impecunious men and wealthy women in this novel, as well as the opposite. The opening chapters of Sense and Sensibility are painstakingly precise about the financial situation of the main characters, the Dashwood women, the widowed Mrs. Dashwood and her 3 daughters. Mr. Dashwood, who dies in the first chapter, left £7,000. Jane Austen names sums. The girls, the 3 of them, have £1,000 each. The interest on that total £10,000 would have been £500 a year. The standard rate of return for investment in government stocks in the early 19th century was 5%, and the readers knew this. So £500 a year is what they all had to live on, and that is just enough to get by on. When Jane Austen's father, the Reverend George Austen, retired from his job as a clergyman and went to live in Bath with his wife and 2 daughters, Jane and Cassandra, they were living on about £650 a year. Bath, quite an expensive place to live. And they just managed to do that with a couple of servants, but there's evidence they had to kind of move a couple of times to cheaper lodgings because that kind of income was only just enough to maintain gentility. This £500 a year the Dashwoods have to live on would have been understood by the reader to be only just enough to get by on. We should note that in the second chapter of the novel, Mr. John Dashwood, Eleanor and Marianne's half-brother, accurately specifies the income of his stepmother and his 3 sisters. In that extraordinary chapter, Mrs. John Dashwood reveals her true avarice and meanness as she dissuades her husband from keeping the promise that he made to his father on his father's deathbed to look after his father's daughters financially. Mrs. John Dashwood did not at all approve of what her husband intended to do for his sisters. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy would be impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree. And those are her words, impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree, because, of course, Mr. John Dashwood is hugely wealthy. He has an income of £4,000 a year, plus his wife's money and some more money that he's been left. So he is hugely wealthy, and his gift, his proposed gift of £1,000 to each of his sisters would have hardly made a dent in his fortune, but it would have made a huge difference to the annual income of those girls. In this chapter, Mrs. Dashwood successfully talks her pliant husband down from these proposed gifts of £1,000 to each of his half-sisters, to eventually the idea of just giving them the odd bit of leftover fish or game in season. But what we should note in that extraordinary second chapter is something that is important for the whole novel, and indeed for all Jane Austen novels, which is that characters know about each other's money. When Jane Austen tells us this information, it's not just information. In her world, the money that people have is almost public information. Characters, you might think, have labels around their necks declaring their monetary value. So incomes are the ways in which characters in the novel label and judge each other. Money is not just background information, it's the very voltage of people's exchanges with each other.